All right. There was one thing drawn to my attention. This, the earnings on the land, or if we're going to tax the price and tax earnings, it is measured on the unimproved value of the land, not the house. It's not on the capital improved. It's on the unimproved value. Yes, so it's without improvements. And so generally, some people will tell you that you can't really determine what the value is, but I reckon most people know what the value of their land is and their house because you have to insure it. So you get a reasonable understanding of what it is. So I just needed to clear that up. Any questions that arose over the break at all? Anybody want to ask anything? All right, that's good. Okay, so now, having done that, now we can make some, now we can draw some conclusions from that particular understanding. Okay, so let me move straight into it. If you've got any questions at any time, just raise your hand. So ask away. Yeah. All right. So central theme. The cycles repeat. Okay. So because they do repeat, we can make some better investment decisions. Now let me give you a bit of background. Yeah. Next slide. Many years ago, back in the 1980s, when I was at school and doing studies and stuff, I did actually have a bent for economics. It was my area of interest. It's what I liked to study. I've still got a few newspaper cuttings from the earliest ones, 1974. I was only what I'd have been 14 or so, and I don't know why, for some particular reason, my dad was always into business and I had an interest in shares and companies and what they were doing. And I noticed one particular day when I was looking at a few newspapers, I noticed that, and I had an interest in gold way back when, I noticed that some of the gold companies, or the corporations listed on the stock exchange, some days they were 20 cents, some days they were 25 cents. And the idea occurred to me over time and said, well, if I bought it at 20 and I sold at 25, I wouldn't have to work for a living. That's just my thought process going through. So that appealed to me. So I took an interest in economics and the stock market and everything else that happens. In between times, though, going through university, I did my degree at RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. I did my economics and accounting there. And you know, absolutely none of those economics professors and the teachers, none of them could explain to me how the economy was generally working. When I got Economics 101, the first thing I was told was that economists will tell you, and the economic books tell you, that you can't have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. Well, I came through the 1970s and the early 1980s, where unemployment went to about 10, 11% in Paul Keating's era. Inflation was running at the same level, and the guys, these professors were telling me, well, theoretically this can't happen, so we're going to ignore that and we're going to teach you something else anyway. And then they come up with these, what they were calling the J curves and all this other stuff. And I can assure you from my university days, I was interested in other curves than J curves. So the J curve just went out the window, really. So I resolved, actually, that I resolved to go overseas and do some travel. And I actually said to myself, I'm not coming back until I've understood how the world works. So I cashed in everything I had. Now, get this. I mean, you talk about how the world has changed, right? I went to the statewide building society on the corner of Queen and Little Burke, I think it was, subsequently taken over by some other banks. I took in my passbook, which had 11,000 something or other written in it. Every time you took your money into the bank, you'd get the passport. The passbook. They have to write in. Oh my God, how things have changed. I took out $11,000 I went down to the Thomas Cook Travel Agency. I put it all in traveller's checks, put it in my pocket, in your bag that you carry. And I said, I'm not coming home until I've worked out what's happening. So I looked up a mate of mine that was in, my friend of my dad's in Switzerland. I got a job there, went around Europe, and then I decided this crazy harebrained scheme that from Switzerland I would basically see if I could walk back to Australia. Crazy idea. So I allowed myself, I could get the train or the bus, or in some places. So I went up to Finland, went into Russia via Finland, St. Petersburg to Moscow, across the Siberian plains into China. From there, went back through the Gobi Desert, back into up north of where the Great Wall starts, and then virtually down into Tibet, across Mount Everest. I got about, what did I get up Mount Everest? I think I got to about 7,100 metres up to the ice pinnacles. Couldn't go any higher because I didn't have anything with me, right? I had to make my own tent and make my own various equipment to get to where I was trying to go. Walked around Mount Everest into Kathmandu into India. Oh, that was an adventure, I tell you. I saw Dean Jones, who I used to play football with. I saw him in Chennai make his 200 something or other, and then basically came back to Australia through Burma and Thailand and that, right? But I had a revelation in India. I had to get some money at the bank in India. Now, in those days in India, we're talking 1986. If you wanted to go to the bank in India, you had to get there very early, because when they'd open the door, you'd have to go to the first counter to show them your passport, the second counter to verify your passport, the third counter to tell them how much money you want, the fourth counter to present your traveller's check, the fifth counter to verify the signatures on. By the time you had to do 11 counters or thereabouts to get just a little bit of money. So you had to get there really early usually. And I was in New Delhi. I was staying in a squat in New Delhi, the only thing I could afford. And I've come down, it was hot, 45 degrees, we're sleeping on the roof. I've run all the way down around 4 or 5 flights of stairs. I've come into the middle of New Delhi in the street in one of the roundabouts, ran right out through the doorway of the small hotel I was staying, and I ran smack bang into the leg of an elephant. What amazed me even more was the kids that were collecting the dung of the elephant for their fuel and heating and everything else, which I saw some terrible stuff in India. I think it's changing now, but after I hit the elephant quite hard, and I was in such a state of shock, I sat myself down on the gutter, and I had a revelation. I said, the economics, it's all about the land. That's what it's all about. And then when I got back to Melbourne, lo and behold, there happens to be a Henry George League in Melbourne, which is the oldest surviving group in Melbourne, and they still put out a newsletter. And here it was, they were telling me all about Henry George. And there it was, all like that. And when I always had an interest in the cycles of things. It's a funny thing, you know. There is another guy, and I think he's from, I forget where now. I think he was from Shepparton. There was another Phil Anderson, very famous cyclist. Came third in the Tour de France. I used to have a standing joke with my son Alan, because Alan grew up in France, and I retired to France a few years back. And I showed him how, when he was only 7 or 8, I showed him how I performed in the Tour de France, right? Because he looks like me, and he was riding for Peugeot, and he finished third. Very impressive, I tell you, very impressive. It just wasn't me, that's all. So he cottoned on pretty quick. So anyway, where was I? Yes. I ended up at the Henry George League in Melbourne, and I made quite a few interesting friends there. They were all 96 not out, most of them, because who'd heard of Henry George in those days? They were basically trying to keep the whole place going. Absolutely nobody interested in understanding the whole economics thing, and nobody interested in land taxes or anything else, history of Canberra, all that stuff. To my eternal gratitude, few of the people there knew I was interested in cycles as such, and they gave me a book called The Power in the Land by Fred Harrison. And Fred, now a good friend of mine, published that book in 1983. He forecast, using a bit of the knowledge I just gave you before, that there would be a downturn, a worldwide downturn that would happen after 1989. So the real estate cycle that he was seeing would peak in 1989. Now he's doing this 7 years in advance, and he said that the top would peak in the peak would come in 1989, after which there'd be a land price-led recession that would basically, you'd see 4 years of declining prices. Now we did that 7 years in advance, and I was reading that in 1991. We had then a family business in embroidery, and we employed about, I was working in the family business, we employed about 300 people or so. So it's a fair sized business in one of the suburbs of out of Melbourne. We were still running one of the few profitable businesses in 1991. Now, I'm not sure I've ever really worked out why, but it did seem that ladies buy more lipstick and lingerie at the start or as we go into a downturn, and embroidery is a very cheap way for garment manufacturers to make the garments look actually a bit more expensive than they are. So we had a profitable business, and we had the banks coming to us because we did have a profitable business, because they had a lot of loans outstanding. So we had a few decisions to make about what we might do for, rather than running a business, become landlords on all these non-performing properties that the banks had, right? So this impressed me with that ability to make the forecast, and I'd always been interested in economics and actually economic forecasting. So when I read this, I really didn't want to be in the family business. I saw this, here's a chance to actually run a business, what I'd always wanted to do, economic forecasting. Now I thought, well, if Fred can do that with the UK, the date of the next profit, 1992. Now most of us here, I think, are old enough to remember what happened in 1991, 1992, very severe downturn, particularly in Melbourne. So you go to the next slide, please, Alan. I decided that I would go ahead and research American real estate because I felt that there's more money in the United States. I could probably have a better business by working out what was happening in US real estate. Now in those days, you think about how much the world has changed. In those days, and we're talking 1992, if I wanted to read a book in the United States, I had to go to the Melbourne Library, request a copy from the United States Library, they'd send it back, I could read it, then I'd go back to the library, they'd send it back to the US. So things have changed. Now, one of the books I got, I was having a look at US public land sales from 1800, which is what we've graphed in front of you. From 1776, from when the Americans got their independence from the British, the 12 states that were in existence in the United States then, they decided to get together to form the United States of America. The way they did that was all the 12 states ceded their land to the federal government, and in 1800 the federal government started selling it off. Now in America they measured just about everything, so I was able to get the statistics of federal government land sales in the United States once the federal government was formed. The federal government came into existence 10th of May, started selling off the land, and wouldn't you know it, just like what Fred says, there is a peak in English and United States real estate every 18 to 19 years. So, from 1800, a peak in real estate, 1818, which you can see, 1836, 1854, 1869, it was actually 1872 in Chicago, 1888, 1908, the next one after that, the next peak in real estate was 1926, every 18 years for an entire century. I thought, man, this is going to be a great business that I've got. I can work for myself. Because I discovered working for my family that I'm unemployable, really. I am not a good staffer. I like to make my own decisions. I like to do my own thing. I like to do it in my own time. So I thought, what better way? I'll run the business, I'll start it and run from there. And that's how I started. And you can see from 1908 then to 1926. Then if we take that a little further onto the next page, I then developed, by the time I had read, and it tells you there, it was Fred Harrison, Power and the Land. It was a book by Homer Hoyt called 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. It was a book by Roy Wenslick called The Coming Boom in Real Estate, that had studied all of the real estate stuff, all the housing, and they had worked out that the cycle they had seen, which Homer Hoyt in the United States, in his book and study of it, which he did the book for his degree at Chicago University, the real estate cycle he observed in the United States, in Chicago from 1800 up to 1932, he said the cycle had never been shorter than 17 years, never longer than 21. Now that gave you a window of opportunity to say, all right, if you're a real estate investor, or even if you're a stock market as well, there are some years where you shouldn't spend your money buying real estate at top prices. Does that make sense so far, where you're sort of getting a bit of a feel? Now, it doesn't tell you exactly year by year, but it was clear. Fred Harrison said, you don't be buying in 1989. He said it's the peak. And so the thing about that, and you've got the clock in front of you, and I'll try and show you how it works, because this clock is based on earnings. And so when you get to 1 and 2 o'clock, so we are on the inner part of the circle, ready for the next boom. Gross rents improve, net rents rise. Now here's the thing, and this is, it's earnings, it's scientific, and it does happen. And so as the downturn moves on, and we move through the downturn, so we're talking, say, 1992, 1993, 1994, people still need to live somewhere. Paradoxically, out of the downturn, rents start going up. If the rents rise, it means you get higher prices for established buildings. Once that happens, it then becomes cheaper to start building, because established house prices go up. It's then cheaper for developers to build new builds. Then you start to get construction, more construction, then you start to get credit growth. You get to 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, mid-cycle slowdown. That process from about 2 o'clock to 11 o'clock lasts 7 years, precisely. You then have a mid-cycle slowdown, which was 2021. From there, you go to the outer side, 13, 14, 15, 1300. The land boom, the world's tallest buildings start to be announced. Why they have to go taller? Because land prices start going up, sometimes frenetically. So developers have to build ever taller buildings to take advantage of the price they've got to pay for the block. Then you get lavish government spending. What did Joe Biden do? How many trillion for his Inflation Reduction Act and all the stuff he wanted to do? Lavish, 3.1? Yeah, lavish government spending. That's telling you where we are in the real estate cycle. 1500, real estate activity frenetic at the peak. Just wait to see if Mr. Trump and the Republicans get their tax cut. More money available to bid more on buildings, on houses. That's the peak. Then you get activity slackening, foreclosures. That was 2006, 2007. That's the cycle. That's what I teach. Okay, so pigeonhole that for the minute. Next slide. I put that into a book, which I would recommend you getting. Of course, I would say that. But we've sold now about 30,000 books now, I think, which is quite a lot for a 400-page non-paperback. So, Next one. I'm going to take a 2-minute aside for a minute, because now, having explained that particular part of the cycle, now we can start to draw some better conclusions about the future, which it's all about, right? Now, I felt I had to do that, because if I start telling you what I think's going to happen next, I would have just sounded like any other forecaster. But now you've got the background to what I've studied and the science behind it and the earnings. I think now you can start to make some fairly good forecasts based on some fairly solid reasoning. Yes? Now, just one thing before we get there, one thing I want to show you. Go to the Shepard-Walwyn website. Economics, you have to understand this. Economics has been corrupted. If you want to read that for yourself, The Corruption of Economics. That came out in 1994. To my eternal gratitude, it's the next book I read after Fred Harrison, and it details for you the job that the elites had to do on Henry George. And it shows you how they wrote land completely out of the equation. Totally. Once you know that, you know you have to stop listening to other economists making a forecast, because they don't know what they're doing. Because there are 3 factors of production, not 2. They'll tell you land is part of capital. Yes? Any farmer knows that land is land. All right, go back to what we do. So, we put out a blog. I work for my own business, Property Sharemarket Economics, as Neil knows. So, with your approval, we've got your email address. I will add that email address to the blog. It's completely free. You can unsubscribe at any time. Is there anybody that doesn't want me to do that? If not, we'll tell Neil and we won't do that. It's completely, there's no obligation. I promise you that every 5 minutes we'll send you something. No, we don't spam you, and we certainly don't pass your address on anywhere. We keep it as best we can. That's all free, no obligation. All right, so we'll add that in. From there, you'll be able to decide what you want to do from there. We do a monthly, what we call our Boom Bust Bulletin, $47, which the blog will tell you about, and the upscaled subscription at $14.40. Again, when we contact you with email, I'll write and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Okay, so you can judge for yourself what you think you need, if indeed you need anything at all, and if you want to take anything further. All right, now let me get into some stuff, some further slides. You don't have a copy of these slides except the back page, which we'll get to in a minute. So next slide, please, Al. Now we can start making some suggestions and forecasts, okay? Now, I could have done this at the beginning, but I just don't think it would have meant a great deal, really. Now you've seen the background of what we've got. Now you understand about earnings and about land, labour and capital. Now you know that because we allow the earnings of land to capitalise into a price, which we buy and sell amongst each other, and the banks create a credit and do a mortgage based on these earnings, we now know that we must get a real estate cycle. So don't ever let anybody else tell you that a real estate cycle can't exist. It must. The only question you have to ask now is, 2 questions really. Can it be forecasted accurately? And why does it seem to be so regular at 18 to 19 years? Because then you can start making some really good efforts and forecasts and to take advantage of it. So, my co-director now, Akil, we got together in about 2011 or thereabouts, and he liked what I was doing. He's a good mate now. We created some statistics together. So he measured the US and UK house price indices, the real house price indices, so it's less inflation. And you can see since 1955, we had a high price in 1973. We had high prices in 1989, which Fred Harrison forecast. what odds were there when I was doing this? What odds were there that we'd get another peak 18 years later? I can tell you, 2006, 2007, I was ready for that. I made a lot of money, even more in the downturn. Now, we always have to be humble when we do this, because in 2006 and 2007, I had a place in Carlton back then, and I'd arranged to meet a good mate of mine in Lygon Street, Carlton, because I was going to the bank, the Westpac Bank, that morning in Lygon Street. Just happened to be a lady manager, and I waltzed in there and I showed her what I had at the bank and various things, and I said to her, at the end of 2007, early 2008, I'm going to come back into your branch because I want a loan, because house prices will have collapsed by then, and it'll be good to be making some investments. Please make sure you're ready, because I'll be ready. Well, you know, sure, she thought I was nuts. As it turned out, in 2008, especially 2009, the only capital city in the world where house prices went up in 2009 was Melbourne. That's because I think all of the Western Australian investors, because China had kept the commodity prices up, they all came with their money into Melbourne and Sydney and started buying, or kept buying. Anyway, it didn't matter, because you've got to be flexible on these things, and you've always got to remain humble. So I couldn't use the money in Melbourne. I also, I retired to France years ago and have an office in London. So the pound collapsed, the Australian dollar stayed high. So I shifted part of the money over into pounds, and I bought 2 places in London. Okay, so you just, you couldn't get it. I couldn't do it in Melbourne. It's just how it was. Went over and did the same in London. Okay, so you have to be humble about these things, because even though I made a decent forecast, I got the city completely wrong. So you need to be aware of I don't do the regions as such. But anyway, I was ready for 2006, 2007. I had the money, and I bought in London in 2009. Okay, so next slide. What have we got up next? So going from 2009, 10 and 11, then US house prices, they bottomed in 2012. Now, as Neil will know, and other people, 1 or 2 of the subscribers here, put your hand up if I say a word of a lie, okay? But since 2012, into 2013, 14, I have been, the real estate cycle works 14 years up, 4 down. It's a land price cycle, and it's US based. Don't apply it to Australia first, US based. 2012, we have statistics that land prices in the US as a whole, not state by state, but as a whole, they bottomed in 2012. 14 years up, I said to anybody who was listening, I said the next cycle, land prices would peak in 2026. And we're almost there. Looking good so far, right? So I acted accordingly with my investments and stuff, and I sat through COVID. I kept doing this, whatever else, waiting for. So I'm in a situation, with my age and things now. I've been winding down, so I've spent the last year or so selling up in a way. I had one place out in St Kilda there that really I just should never have had. It was a mistake, right? We all do those things. It's just one of those things that happen. Sold that, bought another place with cash. So I've got no debt now, except a small mortgage on our place in France. So I live in Indonesia these days, got a place there, no debt. So that's me prepared for and how I worked for 14 years up. I went into debt in 2009 and 10 with what I had. I had people in the places I got, so I'm acting like a bank. I'm using other people to pay off my loan as the cycle went up. So basically, from the places in London in 2009, well, they've tripled really, just about. Okay, so I've never really had to worry much. And in London, they have this unique ability where you can refinance all the time, which is just mind-boggling, amazing to me. So that's what we do. So next one was the UK. And so you can see UK prices recovered pretty quickly into all-time new highs, as they do. Next one. If you go back to the page where you've got the on your handout the circle, the real estate cycle expressed as a clock. This was 2012, 2013. As you can see, rents rise. Rising rents outpace wages. US home prices are surging 13 times faster than wages. Why on earth would you work for wages? Every single year, one of my places has gone up faster than the amount of money I earned working. In my humble opinion, this is terrible, but that's the society that we live in, right? So in one sense, Donald Trump is a product of the real estate cycle. Why you get him as a real estate speculator. That's why he gets where he gets to where he's gone. So, rents rising fast. That told you you're at that part of the real estate clock 3, 4, 5 o'clock. 2012, 2013. And as you can see, the last couple of years, there's been a plethora, enormous amount of tall buildings being announced. I think we've just had another one, Saudi Arabia, Mile High. Yep. Yes? Those buildings, that one particularly, if it gets built, it's almost certain, because history tells you, the building will open in recession, and it will open empty. Okay? That's telling you, their completion date on that's 2028, practically telling you when the recession will be, according if history repeats. The next one, what's our next slide? So, Akil and I, we attempted to stylize the last 3 cycles. So you can see, starting in 1955, and the reason we start in 1955, because Fred Harrison in The Power and the Land did his sleuthing about where American real estate prices bottomed after the Second World War. 1955, 14 years up, 4 down, takes you up to 1973. 75 was the crash and recovery. So 1975 takes you up to 1989, down to 1993, and so 1993 up to 2007. The bottom at 2011, 2012. 2012, 14 years up, takes you to 2026. Fred Harrison very neatly encapsulated what happens in the final 2 years of the real estate cycle. What happens is house prices are so expensive. The government has to do something to keep people coming into that property ladder. So they offer all kinds of incentives. And in the final 2 years of the real estate cycle, and this is what makes it the final 2 years, all of the people who shouldn't really be able to afford the house, they get government assistance. They come in, they get all sorts of loan assistance as well, 5% deposit, sometimes no deposit. Super, you're using the super, being able to come in, but they're coming in right at the end. They're the people, when the land price turns over, they're the people that get wiped out first because they're the ones that can least afford it. And then they turn against their politicians, they turn against the government. If they were left, they turn right. If they were right, they turn to the left side of politics, and then we just get more of the same. We are in the winner's curse now, in my view, because you can see land price is too high. Everybody knows it. Wages not going up fast enough. We're all struggling. Price of eggs, the price of this, the price of that, all high. Remember the good old days about a decade ago when you really did think you could afford stuff? You see where I am roughly? Yes, question.
You follow the interest rates cycles. Are we heading for higher rates like the 70s, 80s?
No. Because the land price has gone so high now, and because the debts are so high, it won't take the same percentage increase in interest rates to cause hardship, to cause an inability to be able to afford things. Normally what happens, I don't normally take account of interest rates and inflation until we get to the end of the cycle, when land price is already too high. So when you're at the end of the cycle, if we get action now that will push inflation up, and it looks like we will, and if that starts to put interest rates up high, because the central banks, the Fed, the Australian Central Bank, they do not like they do not like inflation going too high, so they put interest rates up. They don't tell you they're doing that in that way, but they put it up and say, yes, we'll manage the cycle. We won't do it too much, but they put it up. It's when land price is too high, is when the interest rates go higher and inflation go high. That's when it's least affordable. And if that happens and it's been 14 years into the real estate cycle, that is the top. And so the next likely thing, we'll probably see rates come down a little bit, as they have. But inflation, if that ticks up more, they'll have to put interest rates back up. If they do that towards the end of 2026, that's the end, according to the real estate cycle. Yes? 2027, roughly, thereabouts. Okay? Because now land price is too high. Yes? And you can tell that because people start complaining about their land tax bills. That's when you know land price is too high. Yeah? Okay, next. All right. We have that handout. Do we have that? Yeah. Can you, is it the back last page? Yeah. All right. I have to beg your indulgence now a little bit, because it's here that we're going to step off the planet a little bit. All right? I guarantee you, what I do in the next 5 minutes, you're going to find very hard to believe. Seriously. Okay? Now that's for this room only. I would appreciate it. Keep it to yourselves, because this is the nuts and bolts of what my subscribers get. It's how we forecast the future in an economic sense. What you have in front of you was compiled by the great W.D. Gann in 1909. Now you can choose to believe this or not, but the United States markets, the Dow Jones, as it was known by Gann back then, and he's using the Dow Jones here, will only ever do certain things in certain years. Some years for the Dow will be up, some years will be down, and you can know this in advance. Let me show you. So I'm going to focus on where it says the top 1914. So if you can get that column, can you look at that column 1914? Do you all know where we are? We're only doing 1915A down to 1934. Yes. All right, so you can run it with me, Al, as we go. I probably should have given you the chart, really. Next page, because I've got this here. All right, now what you have in front of you is the Dow Jones from 1911 up to 1935. That's the Dow Jones as it moved. Now, at this particular time in 1914, 1915, for W.D. Gann, this was a forecast. So Gann said, according to the cycles, 1915A, extreme low stock prices, strikes, repression, despair, beginning of a new business generation for 18 3/5 years. 1915A. You all see that, right? 1919B, high stock prices. 1921C, panic. How are we doing so far? Hard to believe, right? 1922D, low stock prices. All right, they've recovered off the bottom. 1924E, high stock prices. Can you see at the end of 1924, the stock market went into an all-time new high. All-time new highs in the stock market is very significant. It means that the stock market involved, or the stocks involved, their earnings are going up, which means the country must be producing better quality stuff because earnings are rising. So any breaks into new all-time highs is usually very bullish. The American market in all-time new highs, it means the companies listed on the American Stock Exchange must be producing better earnings. Better earnings capitalizes into a higher price. Stocks go up. So we had 1924 E, high stock prices. 1925, say 26, 1925 F, panic. Well, it didn't really happen in very early 1926. 1927 G, low stock prices, didn't happen. 1928, 1929 H, very high stock prices, most prosperous year, waste over extravagance, most money in circulation, much speculation. Look where we went up to, right? 1928, 1929. And then we get 1930, 31 J, major panic crash, 4 years of falling prices, 14 years up, 4 down. And then we start again. 1933 K, or A, as it happens, K, same as A, plus strikes, unemployment, many prominent deaths, and so on. This just repeats. So you can see, you can take that up. 2024, 2025, 2026. Bear in mind that can all happen sort of at once. Don't just count on 2024. All right, but we've got 2022, very high stock prices, and as we go, right? Okay. If you want, if you go on to, I don't know, a stock market charting site, bar chart or something, if you get a chart of the Dow, go ahead and go forward. Have a look how accurate that has been over the last 50 to 60 years for a document that was created in 1909. It hasn't changed. Okay, especially if you have a look at 2009, extreme low, 2013 B, high stock prices, 2015 C, panic, 2016 D, low stock prices. If you do that for yourself, you'll see how that works. That's what I do for subscribers. That's how we know, have a rough idea, what markets and what the economy will do 1 year to the next. So we are in a period of extravagance. Lo and behold, Donald Trump is telling us he's going to get for us a golden era. It's completely irrelevant who's in the White House. It just doesn't matter. One thing that has happened, though, since 1860-something or other, since the foundation of the Republican Party, the final years of the real estate cycle, so every single winner's curse going back 150 years, there has always been a Republican take over the White House, every single cycle. And the first thing that they do, or have done every single cycle when they got in, it just happens to be towards the end of the real estate cycle, they abolish all restrictions on banks. It's the first thing the Republican Party does. What happens? Lending breaks loose, things go crazy. They get rid of all of the institutions that are supposed to do the checks and balances on the banks. This is what you're seeing at the moment, history repeating. 2004, 1987, 88, 1969, 1970, 1920s, exactly the same. Republican Party, same type of person in the White House. It just sends the real estate cycle over the top. So I estimate, should history repeat, you've probably got now about 24 months to get your house in order. Up to you what you do, but certainly one suggestion is you don't want to be in a lot of debt now. So now is not the time to get the biggest loan you ever can and buy the most expensive house you can find. Probably the wrong time. Yes? Questions?
Does that mean the banks are collapsing?
Probably, yes.
What scale?
I don't think Australia's got a lot to worry about. They're reasonably well capitalised, and they're not like American banks or the rest of the world where they just extreme lend and extreme credit creation. The banks in the US you have to worry about. The US banks also have another situation. It's the way banks were created. It's the way the Americans seem to like their government. They don't like states surrendering power to the federal government, which I perfectly understand. Sometimes states don't allow banking across state lines. So a bank in the United States can be in a small town, and that small town might be only wheat growers, say. And so if the wheat market crashes, so do all the banks, because they've only got one basic lender, or one basic person getting loans. That can put a bank in a weak position. Australian banks aren't created like that. So they've got a much wider spread of reserves and spread of a lending base, so they don't get into such difficulties. So I'm not greatly concerned about Australia as such.
Are we heading for something similar to 2008?
Yes, in my opinion, yes. But it depends what happens from here. It depends what the Republican Party does. But as you can see, they're getting rid of all of the institutions that put checks and balances on banks. JP Morgan announced the other day that they were no longer going to advise the Fed what they were investing in private credit, which they'd been having to do. So that means that all of the banks getting into private credit, we won't know what they've got. We won't know how liquid it is. If that has to be liquidated very quickly, probably won't happen. So we won't know which banks are creditworthy, which aren't. That can create the circumstances for whispers about who's got credit, who hasn't. You know, you can imagine that on social media now. That's just like wildfire. So all the circumstances are being created for another collapse in due course. Yes.
When we go through this cycle, what's your thoughts on a new currency and the currency cycle, obviously, from US back to British back to...
Yeah. If ever the banks and the federal institutions are going to want people to no longer deal in cash, it'll be in the downturn. And then if the government and the banks have to restart and kickstart the economy like they have to do every 18 years, then it wouldn't be surprising to see a digital currency come into place, and everybody will have to enroll for it, and they might give you 500 digital dollars, which you have to spend within 28 days. That's a possibility. They may do, but as my book illustrates, we have still had a real estate cycle, up and down move, a real estate cycle, whether the currency's been backed by gold, by silver, whether there's been inflation, no inflation, whether there's been a deficit or no deficit, whether there's been high debt, low debt, it doesn't matter, because it's all back to the land and what happens and how high the price goes. And what happens whether we allow the earnings of land to capitalise into a price that is just way out of control. It's got no relevance to its basic earnings ability. And that's the cycle, really. If we all feel good, if we're all fully employed, and we all look forward to the future and things are not too bad and we all think we're going to keep our job, we borrow more. And the banks, you know, when it's raining, they never give you the umbrella when you need it, so they say. And so it just keeps going. And so it's at that point, at that extreme, that you have to do the opposite to everybody else. So I've been suggesting to all my subscribers, as you know, that you now start to prepare for taking advantage of the downside when absolutely nobody's got any credibility, nobody's got any money, and there'll be good deals to be had. Because you want to be on the other side of that now. Yes? And so I just don't think you should be 100% invested in crypto and various things now, right? Because I just think that's what everybody else is doing. You won't get the downside.
You feed into these cycles what's happening in the world in our energy where we've had low cost energy, reliable energy, and we've been able to do what we to buy our appliances and have our factories, to where our energy costs hasn't worked in Germany, France, all those countries are on their knees because they've shut down things generating energy.
All right.
We're madly following, and it hasn't worked anywhere in the world. Could you overlay that in the cycle?
All right, the question is with energy, if you didn't hear it down the back, are there the cycles in energy and can I overlay them? Well, the cycles. For me, I always get back to the land question, or more particularly, the rent and who's got it, who owns it, and who's collecting it. Have you noticed? Could somebody name for me a listed corporation in Australia that they're on the stock exchange and their sole business is solar power? No. Why not? Because there's no rent in it. There's money in it, but there's no rent in it because nobody yet has worked out a way to enclose the sun and put a lid on it and then have to charge you for access to it. But work out oil, minerals, there's a rent in it because somebody can charge for that access. That is why some of the biggest corporations in the world, Shell, BP, they're collectors of the rent. They want energy prices as high as possible within reason so that they build up their profits. They're not interested in solar power. They're not interested in cheap energy. That's what I see. I don't particularly see it so much as a cycle, but I see it as a bit conspiratorial in a way. Yes? Norway worked out, so did Alaska. Norway worked out what to do with that. And Australia should have done this from the very beginning. You collect the rent of oil. You bring a mining company in, they can own the mine, they employ everybody, and they'll do it very well because they're a capitalist company that wants to maximise their profit. But the rent, you take for the public.
You can include gas.
Absolutely, yes.
Sold to Japan for 3 or 4
Yes, indeed.
Now we're being screwed to where it really hurts.
Absolutely, yes. Agreed. So that's, to me, that's politicians. You know, so I don't have an answer for you really, except to try and see behind it about where the rent goes. Yes.
How will China go in all this? They've bought the steel and the coal and the iron ore and built all these high-rise cities. A lot of them are empty.
I don't know about that. I can't comment. It's not my expertise. All I know is, and again, we're getting into areas that I can't, you know, there's so much I'd like to say, but I haven't put the theory behind it. These things, W.D. Gann was an expert. He worked out how history repeats. Well, we all accept that history sort of repeats, it rhymes. W.D. Gann worked out that it works out in set time frames, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 90 and 100. And the most important, looking back, that's going to repeat is 20 years back, 60 years back and 100 years back. Things repeat. And so they'll come in cycles. And so China from 1968 to 1978 was the Cultural Revolution. Devastation in China. I think they're going to repeat that potentially. So you've got 1978 was the Iranian Revolution. That's going to repeat in the 50-year cycle, 2028. We're coming into very difficult times if Gann's correct in what he does, which is why I'm suggesting you need to know what's going to happen, and you need, for the next few years, you need to have good health. You need to improve your health as best you can. I show people how to do that from PSC as well. But I don't want to get too bearish on various things because if you're on the other side, spectacular opportunities coming, utterly spectacular. Be on the other side by having plenty of cash, plenty of good health. Yes, question there.
Just on the real estate again.
Yes.
With the downside of the 4 years down the bottom, has the percentage of the fall been consistent through those 18 years?
Yes, the stock market usually comes back by half. So if the stock market's at 14,000, it'll come back to about 7.5 or 8. Never completely, because we had to have a bottom in the first place. So it went from 1,000 to 7,000. It'll come back to 3.5, say. Usually comes back by 50%. Stock markets. House prices come back usually by 20%, as a rule. That can be buried a little bit depending on what the inflation rate is, because in the 1970s inflation was so high it didn't feel like house prices came down much. They were still sort of rising. So it depends on the inflation rate, but house prices by 20%. Commercial, I wouldn't even bother. I don't know. It depends on where it's built and the location and everything else. On the outskirts of major cities, developments that are just plotted land, so a subdivision, if that's only just newly been subdivided, that can go down to zero because there's no earnings there. And it'll wipe out the builder and it'll wipe out the developer, and it takes years, it takes a decade to recover. But it generally recovers. Somebody else comes in. Yes? Yes, down the back.
Bill, you gave the example how you went to London with your real estate.
Yes.
Why is your personal preference, or is your personal preference in real estate or the stock market? Because the stock market comes back by, you said roughly 50%, say somewhere between 40 and 60%.
Yeah. Well,
I'm curious to know why you've chosen land, or am I wrong in that assumption?
no, well, it just so happens I wrote a book about real estate, and that's what I became known for. But I actually prefer the stock market. I'd much rather talk about stocks in the stock market, but we never seem to get there. So what can you do? I am trying to do another couple of books. One is about a citizen's dividend, another is about Gann. I genuinely think Gann was possibly the smartest person that was ever born, probably. He took the wisdom of the Christians, of Jesus, he took the wisdom of Muhammad, and he shows you how that works in practice. He shows you the timing. So, for example, do good to others and sort of the behaviour that happens now. Whatever you're doing now, if you don't place it under observation, it will repeat. Gann showed you how and when that will repeat, and you're able to work it out. It's in a time frame, a set time frame, and that set time frame is planetary. And so if you know what you've just done, or some particular emotional event, say for example, I don't know, it can be a death of a loved one, or it can be marriage, it can be the birth, whatever it is, that sets up the time frame for your repeat of whatever it is you're doing now. Amazing, I know, but Gann proved it. Gann showed how that wisdom works, and he proved it in the stock market, but you can apply it to your own life as well. And so you're always in the right spot at the right time, mostly. Yes?
The COVID affected the global markets a lot. Did that interrupt the cycles? Predicted at all?
A little.
Does it affect the timelines of the cycles as well?
No, because it's all based on earnings.
Right.
But COVID did bring forward a lot of the land rise that happened, brought forward rather quickly, because we all went out looking for land and houses in outskirts into regional centres. So they went up perhaps a bit quicker than they might have otherwise. And so parts of Australia now, you're sort of seeing a stagnation, whereas otherwise the winner's curse might normally have been a much greater increase. So every cycle happens different. It has to happen different, otherwise we'd all see it. And so the repeat can never be perfect.
Yeah.
Yes?
Is there other things that could affect the cycle as well, like technological advances?
Yeah, good questions.
Nuclear power?
The only thing that will stop, there's only two things that will stop the cycle from operation. That's if a world war breaks out. And that's actually something that's possible at the moment, the way things are going. So if some sort of world-ish war breaks out, then governments get into action, and the first thing they do is stop the buying and selling of speculation in commodities. So you'd get a wool board, you'd get a wheat board. People would be prohibited from buying and selling the different prices. And so the government would want stability, would want guaranteed prices. So the speculators' ability on the commodities goes out the window. They'd also stop the buying and selling of gold. And then the second thing that a government does is they try to get everybody to be patriotic, and start buying war bonds. And generally that sucks up all the money in the economy, which generally doesn't allow for land speculation, buying and selling houses all the time. So that puts a stop to the cycle. And usually we just get a sideways movement, stagnant for a while. The other thing that would stop the real estate cycle is, of course, by taxing the earnings, which is exceedingly unlikely to be ever put into place. Yeah? So they're the two things, mainly. And I think one war-ish is possible, because I haven't spoken about the Kondrati F wave here, because there's so much I could continue to talk about. But if you do happen to get onto the website and what I do, there's just so much reading that you can get on board with, right? It's a steep learning curve now for people really to try and understand the whole land rent thing. Yes. What time we got?
Just expanding on that,
Yes.
technology change. But
Yes.
Given a lot of businesses like your own, you said you have no land component, and as commerce moves more online and less away from physical place, does that mean that the land rent issues mainly residential?
No, that's a good question. It always comes back to the law of economic rent. So it gets back to gravity's going to pull this down. Every technological innovation, everything we think of, everything that's put into the economy, the iPhones, everything else, in the end, all of that increase, all of that wealth will in the end up in land value, mostly. The pie gets bigger, so wages increase a bit, capital equipment. So the pie, the actual wealth, the productive wealth gets bigger, but at the end of the day, it'll end up eventually in land price. So
your business is creating land value with built lands and Vietnam and
yes,
phones and that.
yes, precisely, absolutely, yes. And so the more Apple invents, the more technological innovation we get. It's just an even greater excuse for land prices to go upwards. And so now we've got a worldwide event, yes. But to be fair, it does create shareholder value and does create wealth for people who own those stocks and things. And that's very productive. Those are productive investments. They're stuff. It's creativity, which you'd never want to stifle. But at the end of the day, where we've got the earnings of land able to capitalise into a price, you look at AI, the biggest effect at the moment is on warehouses, right? Yes? Okay. Yeah, any other? We've got to finish soon. Yes?
With your PSE subscription,
yes.
Can we look on the website and research what it offers?
Yes, you can. But if you'd hold off for 24 hours, I'll send it to you as an email. All right? That'll help you work out what to look for. All right? Might be 48 hours, but it'll be a little time. Okay. All right. Finish up. Get some dinner. All right. Thank you very much. It's really good to have been able to chat.